You know how people say children see things adults can't? I used to think that was just a bedtime story. Something parents say to explain why their kids talk to empty corners or smile at the darkness. But I learned the truth when I was 5 years old. In a house that had a door nobody remembered building. It wasn't big. It wasn't even particularly scary at first. It was just there, a plain wooden door in a long upstairs hallway, waiting quietly like it knew me. I don't tell this story often. Every time I do, something strange happened around me. A knock, a flicker, a whisper. But maybe tonight, if I finally tell it from beginning to end, it'll stop. Maybe it'll finally leave me alone. So, if you're listening right now, do me one favor. When I describe the door, don't picture it too clearly. Because once you do, it might start remembering you. When I was 5, my family moved into a 2-story house at the edge of a quiet street in Enugu. It was one of those colonial-era homes. Tall ceilings, cracked white paint, a long corridor upstairs that smelled faintly of dust and old wood. My mother said it used to belong to a British couple before the war. They left suddenly, and no one ever found out why. To me, it was perfect. Big enough to play hide and seek, full of shadows that felt like secrets. My room was at the far end of the corridor, and just past my door, about 6 steps further, stood the door. It wasn't like the others in the house. While every other door had shiny silver knobs, this one had an old brass handle that always felt cold, even in the heat. And right under the handle, a keyhole. No key, just a tiny round hole that seemed to stare back when I stared into it. I asked my father once what was behind it. He said it was probably a small attic or crawl space, and that I shouldn't bother myself with it. But even at 5, I could tell he didn't believe his own words. He avoided looking at it whenever he walked down the hall. At night, the light from my bedside lamp cast long shadows through crack under my door. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd see a faint strip of yellow light glowing under that other door, even though there was no bulb or switch in that part of the corridor. I used to tell my mother. She'd just smile and say, "It's the moonlight, Nena." But the thing is, the door faced the inner wall. There was no window, no way for the moonlight to fall there. One night, I think it was during the rainy season, the thunder kept me awake. The power had gone out, and the whole house was wrapped in silence except for the patter of rain on the roof. I remember lying in bed, counting each lightning flash to calm myself. That's when I heard it. A creak, soft, slow, like with stretching after being still for too long. It came from a hallway. I pulled the blanket over my head, trying not to breathe too loudly. But then came another sound, a quiet tapping, almost polite, like tiny fingers knocking against wood. Tap, tap, tap. It stopped. Then tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the door. I wanted to scream for my parents, but something inside me whispered, "Don't." It didn't feel like danger exactly. It felt like curiosity, like something on the other side was listening, waiting for me to reply. After a while, the tapping stopped, but I couldn't sleep again. When morning came, I told my mother. She laughed and said it was probably a rat or a branch hitting the wall. But later that day, when my father went to check, he said the wall behind that door was made of solid brick. No opening, no space for rats. He said the door was sealed shut, nailed from the inside years before we even moved in. I didn't understand how something sealed could make a tapping sound from inside. It happened about 2 weeks later. My parents had gone to a wedding in the next town. Auntie Ngozi was babysitting me. It rained all afternoon, heavy, endless rain that made the whole house feel smaller. I was in my room drawing pictures when I heard it again, that faint creak in the hallway. I thought it was Auntie. I ran out to call her. But the corridor was empty. That's when I saw it. The door, slightly open, just a few inches, enough for a thin slice of warm, golden light to spill across the floor. Something inside me wanted to run, but another part of me, the part that always wanted to understand things, told me to look. So I crept closer. The air around the door felt different, warmer, but heavy, like the air before a storm. I pressed my palm against the wood. It throbbed faintly, as if it had a heartbeat. I remember whispering, "Hello?" No answer, But when I bent to peek through the gap, I saw movement. Something small and pale darted out of sight, deeper into the light. I pushed the door open wider. It wasn't a room. It was more like a small corridor, shorter, narrower, lined with walls covered in peeling wallpaper. At the end of that corridor was a table, and on that table was a drawing. I picked it up. It was a crude sketch of a girl standing in a hallway that looked exactly like ours. The same pattern on the floor, the same windows. Only the girl had no face. And behind her, in the drawing, was another door, a door with a yellow light under it. I heard footsteps then, light, uneven, almost playful. I turned around. Nothing. When I looked back at the table, the drawing was gone. Just an empty surface, and the faint smell of something sweet, like old apples. That's when Annie Ngozi screamed from downstairs. I dropped everything and ran. She was standing in the parlor, holding her phone with trembling hands. She said she'd just seen a little girl standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at her, before vanishing when the lightning flashed. She described the girl's dress, pale blue, old-fashioned, torn at the hem. That night, I couldn't sleep. The door stayed closed. But I could hear soft humming, like a lullaby I'd never learned, drifting faintly through the walls until dawn. We moved out of that house when I turned 10. My parents never explained why. I remember overhearing them arguing late one night. My mother crying, my father saying something about voices and unfinished business. For years, I told myself it had all been a dream. Kids imagine things. That's what adults always say, right? I convinced myself that the door never existed. Until last year, I was helping my mother pack up her new house after my father passed. While sorting old papers, I found an envelope labeled Nena's Childhood Art. Inside were faded crayons drawings, houses, trees, stick figures. And then one that froze my heart. It was that same picture. The faceless girl, the hallway, and the door with light underneath. Only this time there was something new. Tiny words scrawled in pencil at the bottom corner. Don't forget me. I kept that drawing for months after my father's funeral. Sometimes I'd pull it from the envelope and stare at it under the lamp, tracing the little pencil lines, wondering how my 5-year-old hand could have drawn something so detailed. Other nights, I'd hear faint creaks in my apartment walls, soft, uneven, like someone pacing just outside the room. Then one afternoon, as the rain began to fall, the same restless, whispering rain from my childhood, I got a message from a man named Chuka Ease. He was a property agent. He wrote, "Madam Nena, you once lived at 14 Hillcrest, yes? The owners are selling. They're looking for someone who remembers the house." My first instinct was to delete the message, but something, curiosity, guilt, maybe unfinished fear, made me reply. 2 days later, I was standing in front of that house again. It looked smaller now, swallowed by weeds and vines. The paint had peeled, the windows were clouded with dust, but the roof still slanted the same way, and the upstairs curtains still hung motionless, as if something behind them was waiting for me to look up. Chuka handed me the keys and left me at the gate. When I stepped inside, the air hit me like memory itself, dry, old, faintly sweet. That apple smell again. I walked slowly through the living room. The walls were bare except for faint outlines where family pictures used to hang. Every footstep echoed too loudly. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I paused. The banister was still smooth from where my little hand had once slid down, and at the top of those stairs, I could already see the long hallway. Even after 20 years, I remembered exactly how many steps led to that door. 15. The boards creaked in the same rhythm as before. By the time I reached the end, my heart was hammering so hard it drowned out the rain. And there it was, the door, the same dull wood, the same brass knob. Only now, the knob was turned slightly to the right, as if someone had just closed it behind them. I hesitated for a long time. Every horror instinct told me don't touch it, but the child I used to be wanted answers. So I turned the handle. It didn't budge, locked or nailed again. But when I knelt to look through the old keyhole, there was light, not bright, not electric. It flickered softly, like candlelight dancing in a deep room. I whispered, "Who's there?" No response. Just a long exhale that fogged a tiny circle of glass between me and whatever waited on the other side. I stumbled back. The air in the hallway thickened. The smell of apples turned sharp, like something souring. And then I heard it. A scratch. Slow, deliberate, dragging across the inside of the door. Something was writing. When the noise stopped, silence pressed against my ears. I forced myself closer. Carved into the wood, right under the keyhole, were 3 words. "You came back." I ran downstairs, gasping. I wanted to leave, to call Chuka, anyone, but some heavy pull, like unfinished gravity, made me stay. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a need to understand. I found the old fuse box and flipped the main switch. The bulbs sputtered to life one by one, throwing long, trembling shadows across the walls. Then I noticed something I had never seen as a child. The wall around the door looked newer than the rest. Fresh plaster hiding old seams. Someone had repaired it not long ago. I went back to the living room, found an old hammer left by workers, and climbed the stairs again. Each step sounded like a heartbeat. I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. Then a faint humming. The same lullaby from my childhood. I raised the hammer. Once. Twice. On the 3rd strike, the frame cracked. Dust exploded outward like breath. The door swung inward with a groan that sounded almost like pain. Beyond, it wasn't a corridor anymore. It was a small square room, no bigger than a storage closet. Inside stood a wooden chair, tilted slightly, and a table covered with mildewed white cloth. On the table, a glass cup ringed brown with old liquid, and beside it, a stack of drawings. My drawings. The same child-handed sketches, each one featuring that faceless girl. But in these versions, the faceless girl wasn't standing in the hallway anymore. She was in my bedroom, on my bed, at the window, and in the last drawing, she was standing behind me, a little figure with 2 hollow circle for eyes, one hand raised as if touching my shoulder. Something behind me moved. I spun around. Nothing. Just a faint flicker of candlelight. When I turned back, the drawings were gone. In their place lay a small locket, half open. Inside was a faded photograph. A young woman holding a baby. Her face was pale, almost colorless, but the shape of her eyes, wide and frightened, was unmistakable. It was my mother, and the baby she held wasn't me. On the back of the photo, a date was written in pencil. 1968. 20 years before I was born. Below the date were 2 words. My first. I drove to my mother's house that night without thinking. The rain chased me all the way. She looked older, thinner, as if she hadn't slept in days. When I showed a photograph, her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes filled instantly. Where did you find this?" she whispered. "In the door," I said. Her face went white. Then she told me everything. Before she met my father, she had been engaged to another man, an abusive one. She got pregnant young. Her parents forced her to hide the pregnancy, terrified of scandal. She gave birth secretly in that same house, in the upstairs room behind that door. But the baby, a girl, was born weak and feverish. No doctor came. No priest. She said the baby cried for 2 days straight, then went silent on the 3rd night. Her father buried the child under floorboards before dawn, swearing her to silence. A week later, the man she was engaged to vanished, and they sealed the room, built a false wall, and told everyone the house was being remodeled. When my parents bought years later, she thought it was gone forever. She never told my father. She never told anyone. Until now, I sat frozen, every hair on my arm rising. The drawings, the humming, the smell of apples. They weren't random. They were a child's way of saying, "I'm still here." My mother reached for my hand, sobbing. I thought she was gone, Nena. I thought burying her would make the pain stop. I asked her the only question that mattered. What was her name? Her voice broke when she said it. Adiz. The same name she'd once almost given to me. I returned to the house the next morning. I couldn't stop myself. Something about the story didn't feel finished. When I opened the door again, the air inside the small room was colder, thinner. I knelt by the table, pushing aside dust until I found a small loose board near the back corner. Underneath, wrapped in rotted cloth, was a tiny bundle of bones, and clutched against the chest of that little skeleton was one of my old crayons. Blue, the same color I'd used to draw the faceless girl's dress. I don't remember leaving. All I recall is standing outside in the rain, shaking, whispering, "I'm sorry," over and over. The next day, I took the remains to a priest. He prayed, and we buried her properly, this time with a name. Adiz Obioma, beloved, remembered. That night, I went home and sat on my bed. For the first time in years, the house was silent. No creaking, no humming, no smell of apples. But around midnight, I felt a small draft brush my cheek like a sigh. When I opened my eyes, a faint yellow glow shimmered across the wall, just a thin strip, as though a door had opened somewhere far away. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I whispered, "Rest now." The light flickered once, like a nod, and faded. People think ghosts want revenge. Sometimes, they only want to be remembered. If you ever move into a house with a sealed door, please don't open it. And if you ever smell something sweet when no fruit is near, don't follow it. Because some doors were never built to keep you out. They were built to keep something else in. If this story kept you awake tonight, don't face the dark alone. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join me next week for another true style nightmare. And if you have your own story that won't let you sleep, send it to the email in the description. Until then, lock your doors. And whatever you do, don't listen too closely when the house starts on.